I will never forget the way the morning light slid across the brick of our Boston row house and pooled on the oak floor like warm honey. The Federal-style windows cut skinny rectangles into the living room, and the radiator ticked as if it were counting my thoughts. On the marble coffee table, a fan of contractor estimates dared me to say yes to a new kitchen. I had circled numbers and underlined phrases like custom shaker and quartz counters. Daniel had pushed the papers away last night and said we could not afford to be ambitious. I kept the stack out anyway, the way you keep a door slightly open. My name is Lila Whitaker Brooks, and I live in the United States of America. Our house sits on Myrtle Street in Beacon Hill, a narrow lane with gas lamps, stubborn ivy, and stoops that invite neighbors to talk. I bought the place at 29 after years of tuna sandwiches and second jobs. The mortgage was mine, the sweat was mine, and the vision was mine. Daniel moved in later with tailored suits and a vintage road bike that he parked in the hallway, like a sculpture. He liked to say he brought modern energy to my old house. I liked to say the house had opinions of its own. At 9 o'clock, my attorney, Richard Hale, called from New York. Richard always sounds like a man who has read everything twice. He cleared his throat and told me that my great-aunt, Margaret Whitaker, had passed in Manhattan 2 weeks earlier, and that probate had moved faster than anyone expected. She had left me $100 million. The money sat in a trust I could open immediately. I pressed my palm to the banister I had stripped and varnished with my own hands, and the wood felt cool and steady. The number hovered in the air, like a bird that was either about to land or vanish. Aunt Margaret was the kind of New Yorker who knew the names of doormen and the hours of every museum. When I was 12, she walked me through Central Park and made me promise to learn how money works, so money would not get to tell me who I was. She never had children, but she had shelves full of first editions and a laugh that could cross a crowded room. Standing in my Beacon Hill living room, I saw her apartment in my mind, the velvet sofa, and the view of the river, and I whispered, "Thank you," even though no one could hear. Gratitude came wrapped in shock. I had never held a number like that, not even in pretend. I wanted to tell Daniel right away. I pictured us in the kitchen with the peeling cabinet doors and the slanted silverware drawer. I would pop a cheap bottle of champagne and pour it into mismatched glasses. I would say we could repair the roof and replace the drafty windows without blinking. I would say we could help his sister Renee in Chicago finish grad school without loans. I would say we could donate to the shelter in South Boston that always runs out of coats by January. I would say, in a voice I had not used in a long time, that we were safe. I did not tell him that morning because I had a second call to make. For the last year, through a rocky acquisition, I had stepped back from the daily grind at my company, Whitaker Wren. People like to call me a founder. The title on my internal email was Chief Executive Officer. Up close, that meant contract red lines at midnight, payroll at dawn, and a constant math problem about whose needs to meet first. I had returned 2 weeks earlier under my maiden name for a quiet transition. We had 1,000 people between Boston and New York. I could not know them all, but I tried to know the rhythm of our work. That rhythm was my favorite sound. Daniel liked to call what I did consulting. He said titles were vanity, and that real work does not need a crown. I had let it slide, partly because I was tired, and partly because it seemed easier to let him think the world was as tidy as he wished. Lately, I had been thinking about the day I would tell him the whole truth in one sitting. The scale of the WAI acquisition, the scope of the team, the way decisions stack up like dominoes and you learn to breathe while they fall. I thought about how I would tell him about Aunt Margaret, about the trust in New York, about the quiet reality of a number that large. I thought about the look on his face when he realized I had been carrying more than he knew. I decided to wait until the weekend. It felt important to speak the words at our table with coffee and sunlight. I spent the late morning making a list of small errands: lemons for roast chicken, a new notebook for the next quarter's plans, a condolence card for Aunt Margaret's oldest friend on the Upper West Side. I tucked Richard's follow-up email into a folder on the counter and told myself that patience is a form of care. The house hummed softly as if it agreed. Around noon, I locked the front door and stepped into the brightness of Beacon Hill. Myrtle Street smelled like lilacs and bread from the corner bakery on Charles Street. I thought about how a kitchen should smell on Sunday nights when the weeks are hard. I thought about paint colors and a farmhouse sink and a table with enough space to spread out contracts without moving the salt and pepper. I turned toward Cambridge Street and waited at the crosswalk with a couple holding hands and a boy chasing a red ball on a string. The walk signal blinked green. I remembered the squeal of brakes before the sound of the crash. A delivery van ran the red light from my left, and the world tilted in a way that does not make sense even as it happens. Metal buckled. Glass burst into 1,000 bright birds. The airbag hit me hard and the seatbelt dug into my shoulder. I tasted copper and felt the strange, slow float of adrenaline moving through my limbs. My phone flew somewhere I could not see. The folder with Richard's email slid off the passenger seat and onto the floor mat, and I thought absurdly about paper cuts. Then there were voices. Someone shouted to call for help. A siren rose and drew closer, and the noise braided itself with my heartbeat until I could not tell which was which. I thought about the front steps on Myrtle Street, and how the stone holds the day's warmth long after sunset. I thought about Aunt Margaret's velvet sofa, and the way she had looked at me when she told me to learn money, so money could not tell me who I was. I tried to lift my hand, and it felt far away. A paramedic with kind eyes asked my name, and I said it clearly because my name felt like a rope pulled tight to the shore. He asked where I lived, and I said Boston as if it were a promise I was making to the city itself. He asked who to call, and I said my friend Nora before I said Daniel, which surprised me and did not. The sky narrowed to a rectangle framed by the van's roof and a slice of brick. Somewhere a child cried and then hiccuped back into silence. I inhaled. I exhaled. I counted 3 breaths and let the world go soft around the edges. Inside the ambulance, the ceiling lights looked like a row of moons. The siren pushed the city back and opened a lane that felt impossible on any ordinary day. I thought about the shaker table I had not bought yet, and the way the early morning smells different in New York near the river. I thought about the sentence I had planned to say that night. We are safe. My eyes closed. The last thing I felt was the gentle weight of a hand on my shoulder, and the last thing I knew was that the house on Myrtle Street was waiting for me. And so was the truth I had not yet spoken. The hospital in Boston smelled like lemon antiseptic and old laundry, a tired scent that settled on my tongue. When I opened my eyes, the ceiling lights looked like frosted moons set in a white sky. I tried to move and felt the tug of tubes, the weight of a sling, the dull throb that kept time with my pulse. A nurse with kind eyes adjusted a line and told me her name was Penelope. She said I had a concussion and a fractured clavicle and that my ribs were bruised but not broken. She said I was lucky. I did not feel lucky. I felt like a door that had been taken off its hinges and propped against a wall. The doctor spoke gently in the early light. He said I needed rest and I should avoid bright screens and loud noises for a few days. When he left, Penelope tilted the blinds so a narrow stripe of morning fell across the foot of my bed. In that band of light, dust drifted like snow that had lost interest in landing. I tried to anchor myself. Myrtle Street, Beacon Hill, the MI. United States of America. The house with the stubborn ivy and the banister I had varnished by hand. I pictured its quiet rooms and the way the floorboard near the stove always creaked when you stepped on it. I told myself that the house was waiting, steady as brick, and that I only had to cross a few days to reach it. Around noon, Daniel arrived with a coffee he did not offer me. He stood at the end of the bed with his hands in his pockets, eyes on the monitor like it had insulted him. I said I was glad he came. He said he had a showing in Back Bay and could not stay long. His jacket still smelled like his cedar cologne, the one I once found comforting. I reached for his wrist. He flinched, as if touch were a bill he did not want to pay. He asked if I had signed any forms that would cost us money. I told him insurance would handle most of it, and I heard how small my voice sounded. He left after 5 minutes. Penelope came in with a chart and watched the door long after it clicked shut. She asked if I needed anything for pain. I told her I was fine, even though I was not. People who are used to shouldering their weight say fine without thinking. When she checked the drip, her fingers moved with careful grace, like someone folding an expensive shirt. You should rest, she said. I closed my eyes and listened to the hallway. The wheels of a cart, the soft question of a visitor at the nurse's station, the faraway burst of laughter that felt like a radio left on in another room. He returned in the evening. The light had flattened, and the room was all quiet edges. Penelope had dimmed the overheads, and the machine beside me hummed at a slower rate, as if it believed I might let it lead. Daniel came in alone, closed the door with 2 fingers, and did not sit. He looked at me the way he looked at cracked tiles or paint that had begun to peel, as if I were a thing that needed fixing by someone else. He said, very calmly, "I cannot afford to support a freeloading wife. Now you have an excuse to rest in bed. I cannot bear an ill-favored freeloading wife anymore." The words hit me like a second accident. I felt the same float, the same disbelief that this could be happening in a room that counted heartbeats. I tried to tell him about the inheritance, about Aunt Margaret in New York, about the trust and the number that still felt like it belonged to a story rather than a life. $100 million. I said the words and waited for the world to shift. He waved them away with a small flick of his fingers. "You always make everything dramatic, Lila. If you had a real job, we would not be in this mess. Heal fast because I am out of patience." He turned and left, and the click of the door settled in the room like a period at the end of a sentence I did not write. I stared at the blinds until they became ladder rungs. I climbed them with my eyes, slow rung by slow rung, until the ceiling softened and the edges of the room gave up their shape. Penelope came in, pulled a chair close, and sat without speaking. She let the silence be a blanket. When she finally spoke, she said the quietest, true thing I had ever heard. "You can be lucky to be alive and unlucky to be loved by the wrong person. That is not a contradiction." I cried then, not loud, just a clean stream that did not ask for permission. Penelope handed me a tissue and went about her tasks with the dignity of someone who has seen mornings and midnights that would break most people. When she left, she squeezed my good hand and told me I could press the call button if I needed a human voice. The machine kept its steady hum, indifferent and faithful. At dawn, the light returned and tried again. Richard called from New York with a voice that always knew where the floor was. He said he could fly up and bring the trust papers, that he could be in Boston by lunch if I wanted. I told him to wait 2 days. I wanted to stand when I signed. He did not laugh. He said he would be there when I was ready, and that he had already notified the bank to expect my signature. I pictured a conference room with wide windows and a view of the Hudson, and I pictured my aunt's velvet sofa and the way she stacked her books in careful towers. I whispered thank you again, to her or the room, or to the part of me that had learned to keep going. By mid-morning, Nora swept in wearing sneakers and resolve. She carried a bouquet of peonies wrapped in brown paper and a tote bag full of snacks she knew I would not eat. Her face held that particular light that appears on the faces of friends who are willing to carry you across a hard stretch of road. She kissed my forehead and set her bag down with a thump that felt like a promise. She said she would stay the night in the chair beside my bed. She said she would call my office and tell them I needed a week. She said she would call Daniel for me, and I told her not to. It felt important to protect the last thread of something, even if I could not name what it was. Nora did not argue. She has always been good at letting me keep my illusions until I'm ready to set them down. She adjusted the flowers and opened the blinds another inch. We talked about small things because small things are the ladders you use to climb out of shock. She told me the coffee shop on Charles Street had added lemon bars to the menu. I told her the radiator in the living room had finally stopped knocking at midnight. We made a list of shows to watch when my head stopped pounding. She curled up in the recliner with a book and fell asleep in a way that told me she trusted me to breathe on my own. On the second night, the rain came, first as a rumor on the windows, then as a steady conversation with the glass. It did the talking I could not do. The room darkened and softened. I drafted the speech I would give Daniel when I went home to Myrtle Street. I would tell him about the trust in New York and the way Aunt Margaret had made a promise to the future and kept it through me. I would tell him I had set aside money in my head for the shelter in South Boston, for my neighbor with the cranky space heater, for the roof that needed repairs before winter. I would tell him that kindness is a budget you write on purpose. I would tell him the kitchen could be rebuilt without debt, and that the windows could be replaced without fear. I imagined him saying he had been scared, That fear had turned into cruelty in his mouth. I imagined him asking for a second chance. I fell a little in love with a version of him that did not exist. I slept between bursts of rain. In those short pockets of rest, I dreamed of the house the way it was, sturdy and narrow, with light that moved across the floor like quiet water. I dreamed of New York and the river near my aunt's apartment, and the way the air smells near the park after a storm. I dreamed of a table that could hold contracts and plates at the same time, a life where work and warmth were allowed to share one surface. When I woke near dawn, the rain had ended, and the sky had the washed blue that belongs to second chances. Penelope reset my sling and told me my scans looked good. Nora stretched and yawned and offered me a terrible granola bar. I took a bite, because sometimes you eat the thing you would rather not, simply to prove you are alive. By then, I knew the truth I had been circling. I could sign papers in Boston or New York, and I could rebuild kitchens and roofs, but the real work would be done in the part of me that had learned to make myself small to fit inside someone else's comfort. Money could open windows. Courage would open doors. When I finally went home to Myrtle Street, I would not only bring a signature and a plan, I would bring a spine that matched the house that held me. 2 days later, Penelope tilted the blinds and pale Boston light poured across the foot of my bed. I had been practicing how to hold a pen with my bandaged hand so I would not tremble when Richard arrived. The sling pulled at my shoulder, the IV beeped softly, and the room smelled like lemon and clean sheets. A knock came. I pictured Nora with awful coffee and better gossip. Instead, Daniel stepped in, and a woman followed so close behind him that their shoulders almost touched. She was tall, the kind of tall that makes posture look like a decision rather than an accident. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat knot, and a thin diamond band flashed when she moved. She glanced at my face, only for a second, then looked away as if she had touched a hot stove. Daniel smiled, the cheap kind, the one he used at open houses, when he wanted to seem charming without doing the work. He said he had come to check on me. Then he said he thought I would want to meet his new wife. There was no correct first word for that sentence. Penelope went still beside the monitor. I watched the green line lift and settle, as if my body might answer for me. The woman kept her gaze pinned to the chart at the foot of my bed. Daniel leaned a forearm on the rail, and the way he bent toward me felt like a theft of air. Before he could speak again, the woman looked up properly. Her eyes ran over my face, then widened as if a light had been thrown on inside her head. She blinked once, then twice. Her hand flew to her mouth. She took one step back and said, "Two," loud for the doorway not to hear, "She is my CEO." Silence folded over the room. The hallway outside paused. Penelope's eyebrows lifted, then knit together. Daniel gave a short laugh that sounded like a cough. "No way," he said. "You must be kidding." The woman shook her head hard enough to loosen a strand of hair. "I am not kidding," she said. Ms. Brooks. I am Sophie Marlowe from Whitaker Wren. We met once in the Boston office after the acquisition call. You spoke about the new product division and the team in New York. I am a project manager on the harbor team. I had no idea you were married to Daniel." A small, bitter smile settled on my mouth before I could stop it. Daniel had never once come to a company event. He never listened when I tried to describe what my days looked like. He told people I did freelance marketing. He said titles were vanity and that real work does not need a crown. I let it slide because it kept the peace and because I was tired. At work, I used my maiden name during the transition. I wanted clean paperwork and quiet rooms to build in. I got both, and more distance than I planned. Daniel felt the balance of the room tilt away from him and tried to force it back. "Lila is exaggerating," he said. "Sophie, you must be confused. This is not your CEO." Sophie looked at him with the kind of pity women reserve for men who misread the world. "We receive company letters signed by her," she said. "She runs the town halls in Boston and New York. I report to a director who reports to her. If she is not my CEO, then who is?" A soft knock saved him from answering. Richard slipped through the doorway with an understated leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He wore a gray suit that looked like it had finished its homework. He took in the room in a single practiced glance, the way attorneys learn to count exits without moving their heads. Ms. Whitaker, he said, setting the folder on my tray, the trust from the Whitaker estate is ready for your signature. Upon signing, $100 million will transfer into your control according to the terms. Would you like me to read them aloud? No one spoke. Even the monitor seemed to lower its voice. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Sophie like she should produce a reasonable explanation for an unreasonable fact. Sophie's cheeks had gone the color of paper. I am so sorry, she whispered to me. I did not know he was your husband. I would never. Penelope shifted her weight in that subtle way nurses do when they are preparing to protect a patient without causing a scene. She moved a fraction closer to the rail and placed a calm hand near the call button. It felt like standing behind a fence that you did not know you needed until someone tried to climb it. Daniel tried again, this time with the voice he uses when a buyer discovers mold in a basement. Let us not make a spectacle, he said. Lila, you could have told me about this little inheritance. Perhaps we would have handled things differently. Little inheritance landed in the room like a bad joke no one wanted to claim. Richard did not turn his head, but his expression answered for me. Mr. Brooks, he said in a tone as flat as the Charles River on a windless morning. The trust details are confidential and need only be discussed with my client. If you are no longer her spouse, your presence here is puzzling. If you are still her spouse, your earlier introduction of a new wife is puzzling differently. Color rose in Daniel's neck. He started to speak, then stopped when Sophie took another step back from the bed. She had not removed her hand from her mouth. Her eyes had the glassy sheen of a person who has just realized that a story they believed about themselves is not true. I could see her thinking. The fast math of a person mapping a courthouse ceremony in Providence against the word husband, spoken in a hospital in Boston. I met her eyes and tried to set down a soft place for her to land. Sophie, I said, you did not do this to me. If you want to step outside, Penelope can get you some water. Penelope was already moving because good nurses are 2 steps ahead of need. Sophie nodded and slipped toward the door. Daniel reached to catch her wrist, and she pulled her hand away as if his touch might leave a mark. She disappeared into the hall. The room felt larger without his performance audience. Richard opened the folder and placed a pen gently in my left hand. We can do this now, he said, or we can wait. I am here for your timing, not mine. I looked at the signature line and saw my name spelled in full. Lila Margaret Whitaker Brooks. The W had always felt like a hinge that held my lives together. The woman who built a company in Boston, and the girl who sat on a velvet sofa in New York while her aunt taught her how compounding works. I steadied the pen and signed. The W in Whitaker looked like a mountain ridge. It felt like I had climbed to it. As I finished the last stroke, the air in the room changed. No drum roll, no sudden music. Just a quiet, undeniable shift, the way a house feels when you replace a cracked window and the draft finally stops. Richard slid the signed page into the folder and closed it with the careful certainty of a man who ties knots that hold. Daniel cleared his throat. So, he said, extending the word into a strategy he had not yet invented. Perhaps we should talk privately. I am sure we can find an arrangement that suits us both. No, I said. It was not loud, but it was complete. You said, you could not bear an ill wife. You found a new one quickly. You came here to mock me, and instead you learned who I am. That is the only arrangement that will happen in this room. Penelope stood a shade closer, not looming, simply present. Richard remained at my side, the folder tucked beneath his arm like a shield built of paper and law. Daniel looked at each of us and realized that power had left his hands and did not plan to return. He tried one last door. You are being dramatic, Lila. You always are. I smiled, not bitter this time. Simply done. Dramatic would have been throwing the vase of peonies at his head. I kept my hands still. I looked at the nurse who had watched me breathe when breathing felt like a job. I looked at the lawyer who had brought me a future folded neatly at the corners. I looked at the man who had mistaken my restraint for weakness. Then I said, please leave. He did not with the slam he favored at home, but with a small, embarrassed shuffle that made him look shorter than he was. In the doorway, he almost collided with Sophie, who was returning with a paper cup of water. She did not meet his eyes. She stepped around him and handed the cup to Penelope to pass along, then stood on the far side of the room near the window, a deliberate distance marked in linoleum. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the water and the truth." I nodded. The monitor returned to its patient hum. Outside, a cart rattled. Somewhere down the hall, a television carried the low murmur of a game show. The world resumed, but the story did not go back to how it had been. I had signed my name. The number in New York had become a fact in Boston. My house on Myrtle Street would have new windows before winter. My life would have new doors. Penelope straightened the blanket at my waist, the small domestic gesture that always undid me. "Rest," she said. "Richard will handle the bank. I will handle the hallway. You only need to handle yourself." For the first time since the accident, I believed her. I closed my eyes and saw the narrow brick house that had waited. For me, steady and stubborn, a quiet backbone on a quiet street. When I opened them, the room was the same, yet not. Courage had taken a seat by the bed and decided to stay. The discharged nurse wheeled me to the curb 2 days later, the morning bright and a little cold. Nora idled her old Volvo under the awning on Cambridge Street and popped the passenger door, like she had been waiting her whole life to do this exact kindness. We were supposed to go straight home to Myrtle Street, but I asked her to stop in the financial district first. Richard kept an office in a brick building with a view that let Boston imagine itself as glass and river. He met us in a conference room with a walnut table and a carafe of water set on a tray like a promise. I told him everything. He took notes with the neat indifference of a court reporter and called a family attorney in New York while rain moved. Across the windows in long, forgiving strokes. We filed for divorce that afternoon. The prenuptial agreement I had insisted on years earlier did its work with quiet efficiency. Daniel had once called it unromantic. I told him then that romance should never be afraid of clarity. Discovering he had married again in a courthouse, sprint in Providence before dissolving the first marriage made the paperwork messy for him, not for me. I chose the simple path. The agreement protected the house on Myrtle Street and everything I had built before him. The Whitaker Trust protected itself by design. Richard handled the filings and the calls, and I signed what he slid across the table, my hand steadier with each line of ink. Home felt like a person who had been holding a breath. The kitchen floor creaked under my brace, the same creak near the stove that had always announced me to the quiet. I leaned on the cool marble counter and cried because I could, and because Penelope had been right. You can be lucky and unlucky in the same life. The trick is learning which is which and choosing accordingly. I took a long shower, put on a soft sweater, and stood in the living room listening to Beacon Hill move through an ordinary afternoon. The house did not ask what came next. It only kept standing. Word traveled quickly through Whitaker Wren. Human. Resources sent a careful email about a possible conflict of interest. I replied that I would recuse myself from any personnel decisions involving Sophie and asked our general counsel to observe the separation. Then I wrote Sophie a short note. I told her she did not cause any of this and that if she wanted to talk, Nora and I would meet her at a cafe on Charles Street with crooked chairs and generous cinnamon. She came the next day with shaking hands and a notebook she had never opened. She apologized 3 times before she sat. I told her I believed her, and that belief did not require her to perform pain. We drank coffee and talked about small things, and she cried once, quietly, when she said she had signed paperwork in Providence without understanding the timeline that made it a performance instead of a marriage. 2 weeks later, the contractors arrived like an orchestra that knows its music. Scaffolding went up. Old windows came out. I signed a check for $82,000 to repair the roof, replace the windows, and rebuild the kitchen. I chose shaker cabinets in a warm white and a long farmhouse sink that could swallow a stack of dishes without complaint. I paid off the mortgage in Naubai, full. The deed sat in my hands with the solid weight of certainty, and I held it the way you hold a newborn. I bought a simple shaker table for the dining room because I wanted a place where decisions could sit without wobbling. The first check I wrote from the trust outside the housework was for my people. $10 million into a bonus pool for Whitaker Wren employees across Boston and New York. Another $10 million into a fund dedicated to women-led companies in the United States and the United Kingdom. A promise to the future disguised as a balance sheet. $2 million to the shelter in South Boston for beds and heat and winter coats. $1 million to a literacy program in Roxbury that knows how to make the first chapters of a life larger. Daniel tried the oldest tricks. Calls that went unanswered. Texts that began with apology and slid into revision. An email with the subject line misunderstanding, as if the word could move furniture. He asked me to meet at a hotel bar in Back Bay. He asked to talk on the stoop of the house he had once insisted he should be on the title for. I did not meet him anywhere. Richard forwarded him the final decree and a polite request to return the spare key. When Daniel finally brought the key in a clear plastic envelope, I happened to be on the stairs, one hand on the varnished banister, and I had sanded myself. He looked around at the new windows and the clean lines of a door that fit the frame, and his face wore the bafflement of a man who has discovered that gravity applies to him too. "You could have told me," he said. "You could have listened," I said. He dropped the envelope on the hall table and let the silence do the rest of the work. When the dust settled and the painters left, I hosted a small dinner in the new kitchen. Nora brought a lemon tart from the bakery on Charles Street. Richard brought a bottle of champagne with a label that had paid its taxes. We sat at the shaker table and ate slowly because there was nothing to rush toward. We toasted Aunt Margaret, roofs that do not leak, and friends who show up with blankets when the weather turns inside your chest. I set my grandmother's simple gold ring beside my water glass and thought about the women in my family who had turned quiet resolve into a kind of wealth. In early autumn, I took the train to New York to meet Richard and our new board chair, in a glass building where I liked to watch the Hudson River go by. I wore a navy suit and low heels because I wanted height without noise. The meeting moved through agenda items with the confidence of people who had done hard things before breakfast. When it ended, I walked down to the river and let the wind lift the hair off my forehead. I mailed a postcard to Penelope, the nurse who had sat in the dark and told me a truth I needed. "Thank you for telling me the quiet thing," I wrote. I sent Sophie a short email saying I hoped her new apartment in Cambridge felt like peace. She replied with a photo of an empty bookshelf and a smile that hid in the corner of the frame. She said she had been promoted to senior project manager on Harbor and had found a therapist who made the floor feel reliable. Back in Boston, the house found its new hum. Morning light moved across the oak floor and stopped to rest at the edge of the shaker table. I walked to work more, leaving early enough to buy a coffee on Charles Street and cross the Longfellow Bridge while the Charles River pretended to be glass. I kept a coat in my office so I could slip out and stand by the water when meetings stacked up like dishes. I bought my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harrell, a better space heater before the first frost, and paid the bill for a handyman who fixed her stubborn window sash. None of this made me a saint. It only made me responsible for the place that held me. One evening, after a long day of product reviews and a well-timed joke from our New York team, I stood at the sink and listened to the city hum. I dried the last glass and set it on the new shelf. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert for a Whitaker-Wren town hall in the Boston office the next morning, the sort of meeting I once approached with a stomach full of nerves. I imagined looking out at faces that were building something with me, not for me. The difference mattered. This is the part of the story I do not want to forget. I did not need Daniel to agree that I was worthy for it to be true. I did not need anyone to tally the inheritance for the number to change what I could build. The house stands, the company grows, the city keeps its promise. I live in the United States of America on a narrow street with gas lamps and stubborn ivy, and I am the one who decides what comes next. I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs, the banister warm under my palm, the windows quiet in their new frames, the door I had closed behind me, and the window I had opened wide.